Hello, I'm Lindsay Nelwer-Benowich, Director of the Faith in Action Project, and I'm delighted to be here with you for the Day of Giving at Christian Theological Seminary. As we work to discover and deploy lasting solutions to poverty in Central Indiana, the Faith in Action Project also seeks to provide lifelong learners like you with information, best practices, and inspiration from people who've walked out of poverty, all so that you might gain a deeper understanding on poverty and systemic injustice and discern how you will respond. We invite you to show your support to CTS today by giving a gift to the seminary and feel empowered to respond to the call of action that Nisha Patel offers in her most recent discussion. Listen now to the interview with philanthropic advisor Nisha Patel and moderator Rodney Burns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodney, for having me, and thank you to Christian Theological Seminary for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you.
We're excited to dig in and kind of right off the bat. You spent your entire career doing God's work. We touched on a little bit of it in your resume, but you've helped the most at-risk populations in our country navigate a path out of poverty. We all know how difficult this work is, how very difficult it is, and getting up every day and fighting the same fights to help these folks. What inspired you to get in this field, and what motivates you today to make this real change?
It's interesting, Rodney, you referred to doing God's work. And when I launched my consulting practice, I very intentionally named it Powered by Shakti. And Shakti comes out of my faith tradition, which is Hinduism. And Shakti is female power that comes from within and the agent of all change in the universe. And so that was very intentional. The change that I hope to be about in the world, and that I've always been about, is how do we create access to better economic opportunity for people who've been locked out. And very often in the United States, it is not exclusively, but it's often people of color who have been locked out of that opportunity. And I would say one of the people who inspires me, continues to inspire me to do this work, is my 94-year-old grandmother. Who I get a lot of my religious teaching from. And she was born in the 1920s in India, was orphaned as a young child, married very young, married my grandfather, who was a teacher, moved to Uganda, raised her 6 children there. And just when she had achieved a happy middle-class lifestyle, the earth was swept out from under her because there was political turmoil. She became a refugee. And so, it's that idea that, knowing that structures and political and social and economic forces play a big role in who has access to opportunity. So she ended up moving to Scotland, living there, and now lives in the United States. And I have had the blessing during this pandemic of spending a fair amount of time with her. And so I know that there are millions of people like my grandmother who have their own stories all over the United States. And, it's like, but for the structures and the context and the situation they happen to be born into, or the situation that swirls around them, access to opportunity isn't equal. And so I've had the privilege in my work of traveling and working all over the country and meeting people who are overcoming the same obstacles, dealing with the same structural challenges. And that is what continues to inspire me every day.
Excellent. That's a great story and great kind of balance as you kind of, again, attack this work. So we're here in Indianapolis. It's a great city. It's a Midwestern kind of values. I guess you would say slow paced compared to DC or New York. But, as a community, we've come together to tackle some big issues over the last 50 years. We've had great mayors and a great business community and a great faith community that's come together to do some extraordinary events. But one thing we just haven't figured out yet is our poverty issue. We're still in the bottom third of all major cities around the country from nearly all metrics of poverty, including childhood poverty. But we're here, this business community, the faith community, and other leaders are here to kind of put that same Hoosier hospitality mentality together to kind of tackle this issue, because we're only as good as our least citizens. And when we caught up a few weeks ago, I was surprised to learn that around poverty, you've interacted with a few groups, from Indianapolis, including some of the stuff at the community foundations and what they're doing. Did you have a sense of, are we gotten on the radar nationally as far as some of our efforts, and how can we continue to raise the bar with our approach to this critical issue?
I would say it's been wonderful, a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about some of the great work that's happening in Indianapolis and in your community. And I would say it's not on the radar enough, as is often the case in national conversations about innovation. There is this stereotype, which just isn't true, that innovation somehow only happens on the coasts. And I know for a fact, having spent time in almost every state and many, many different kinds of communities across the country, innovation happens everywhere. There are creative people everywhere, and particularly, I think, in under-resourced communities. They should continue to be under-resourced, but often it's that, necessity is the mother of invention, right? There is wonderful work happening all over the country. And I think in terms of raising the bar, it goes to something that you said in your introduction, which is that when I say we as a field, whether that is philanthropy, policymakers, the business community, the faith community, in crafting solutions, typically we go to sort of what we think of traditional experts, right? People will call me a lot, and I'm happy to share what I have learned and what I know from over my years of work. But often enough, we don't start with people experiencing poverty themselves, and that's kind of wacky if you think about it, right? There is no private sector company that would develop a product and just roll it out without first testing it with the consumers for whom it was intended. Yet somehow, when it comes to solving poverty, we do that all the time, right? We think that, like, oh, well, and we should talk to the researchers and the sort of policy experts. That's good to do, but sometimes policies get rolled out, programs get rolled out, and we wonder why people aren't showing up and it's not being taken up. And it's like, well, did you ask the people for whom it was intended what they need and what they want and what their ideas are about the solution? And if we start to do that, I think that's how we lift the bar. That's how we get policies and programs that actually work.
That's fantastic. You often talk about restoring the American dream through mobility. Can you talk to us a little bit about how, through your research, you came to define mobility? Because it's not as simple as it seems.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I've been spending a lot of my time on the last few years. So I had the privilege, as you shared in the introduction, of serving as executive director of something called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which I often talk about as like it was such a privilege to help to support the Justice League of Poverty Fighters. And so we had an amazing, diverse group of experts, and we had a 2-year homework assignment for this commission, which was answer the question, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? So we first said, well, if we're going to do that, what is mobility? Like, how will we know if we're successful? And we certainly were not the first group, the first commission to try to tackle poverty in the United States. But one of the things that I think really made our work different from efforts that had come before is that we didn't use a narrow definition of poverty and mobility. Okay, and so what I mean by that is typically in the United States, when we talk about poverty, we're talking about an income measure. So the federal government has a measure that they use, and right now in 2021, for a family of 4, the poverty threshold or the poverty level is set at just over $26,000. And so if you stop and think about, well, if what we want to do is support families on a journey to mobility, to sustainable mobility, if we come up with solutions, and we had a bunch of smart economists, we could do this. We could figure out how to model a bunch of policies and say, let's get families over that line. Let's get families to a place where they can be earning $26,001, right? And if you think about that, and then you think, well, if a family now is $1 over that line, are they actually out of poverty? Are they actually on a pathway to sustainable mobility? And we know that the answer pretty quickly becomes no. Think about in Indianapolis, surviving, let alone thriving, on $26,000 a year for a family of 4. That is going to be a struggle. And so there has to be something more than just that simple income measure. And as we got into our conversations, one of the members of our group, John Powell, said something that just really made all of us stop and think. He said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. it's also about a lack of power. And that really led us to say, okay, yes, income, economic success, income and assets, the things that we typically measure are important. That's foundational. People do have to have enough money, but that's not enough if we're talking about sustainably moving out of poverty. When we talk about power and autonomy, it's about having a sense of agency. Do you have a say on the trajectory of your own life? Do you have a say about what happens in your community? Then we said, that's still not enough. There's a third piece, and we ended up labeling that third component of mobility as being valued in community. And I think that's very relevant for the audience here, for people in faith communities, in the business community, and nonprofits. How do we create a sense of belonging in community? One of the big challenges around poverty in the United States is that it is very stigmatizing. We have these very negative narratives about poverty and about why people are in poverty. And as Americans, we tend to other, I'm using other as a verb, we tend to other people who are somehow different from us, right? You're either inside my circle or you're outside the circle. And what we really need, and what would help us get a lot further in terms of sustainable mobility, is creating a sense of belonging. So some sociologists will talk about this as social capital or social networks, but it is part of the structure that helps sustain all of us, right? No matter who we are or what our level of income.
That's great. It hits home for me as well as a real estate developer. Kind of when we go in these communities and for all the right reasons, but oftentimes we come across as doing for the community, not with the community, or valuing them as what their role is. And we had to learn the hard way, but it really is. It's such a critical component because everyone, that we're talking about, they want a better lives for their children. They want to progress themselves with all these barriers that we talked about, and we're going to hear about in this session and sessions later. That makes sense, kind of how you guys came to the definition of mobility. So how do we tackle it? What's next? What can we do to really tackle this issue and kind of execute on your guys' ideas and your big thoughts?
Yeah, so what we came up with in our effort, and this was an effort, guided, as I said before, not just by research and sort of the best evidence. We actually spent time in 30 different communities around the country, breaking bread with people experiencing poverty, and setting a bigger table and creating space at the table for voices of people experiencing poverty. And by the way, and compensating them for their time, just like I as an expert get compensated when I am asked to sit at a table. When we're asking people to share of their lived experience and their wisdom, we need to compensate them and honor their time as well. And through that process, in addition to that definition of mobility, what became pretty clear is that, it's as much as we'd all love to have, one singular answer, here's the solution, here's the magic pill that's going to solve poverty, there isn't one. And what we came up with was really 5 big mutually reinforcing strategies. And to shorthand them, and I'm happy to share a little bit about each of them, we said, there are really 5 things that we need to focus on collectively. And that is narrative, jobs, place, people, and data. And so what do we mean by each of those? So the reason we led with narrative, it goes back to what I was saying before about poverty being so stigmatizing, the way we often Americans think and talk about poverty. It is as though there's something wrong with a person, as opposed to recognizing the structure and the contexts that keep people trapped in poverty. And so we said one of the most important things we need to do is change the narrative around how we talk about poverty and about people experiencing poverty. And why is that so important? It's important because narratives you can think of as the overarching story or the big story, right? They are the context for everything. They are the stories that we tell ourselves as people to make sense of the world. And often that does come out of our faith traditions, our communities, our families. So if we believe that people are living in poverty because it's their own fault, because they made a series of bad decisions, that will lead us down the road on one set of strategies. But if we recognize the structural forces that are keeping people in poverty, right? We have had public policies in this country that have discriminated against people, particularly based on race, in terms of access to affordable, high quality housing, and Rodney, you know about this from the work that you do in real estate development, right? People have not had the equal access to good jobs and to good schools and to safe neighborhoods. And so we've got to recognize those structures. We've got people who are working very hard, but not being paid a fair wage for their labor. People can be working full time at minimum wage in this country and still not be able to afford housing and afford childcare. And that's not just down to one person, right? These are structural issues that impact lots of people. So we need to shift narratives to recognize structural issues before we can get to the kinds of solutions that will really work. And then second, around the issue of jobs. It is impossible to solve poverty without understanding the economy and jobs, and that people need access to good jobs that pay a family supporting wage. And in a context like the one we're living in, and in this pandemic in particular, or in communities where there aren't, everyone doesn't have access to that type of job, or isn't able to, because of structural issues or particular obstacles they may be experiencing, work full time. We need other ways to provide income support to families, and particularly to families with children. And then the third piece around place. We know that right now, zip code matters a lot. We have large data sets that now tell us that the zip code that you're born into, which you have no choice in, right? That zip code can have a profound impact on your outcomes later in life. And so we need strategies to ensure that every neighborhood can be a neighborhood where children and where families can thrive, where there is access to those good jobs and good schools and transportation routes. And other amenities, right, that make for a life: playground, parks, the arts, and then people. And this again goes back to this idea of centering families and people in the programs and policies that we develop. We have billions of dollars that are deployed across the country, public resources, philanthropic resources, private sector resources, that are geared at, on their surface at helping families move out of poverty. But often they fail to center families. They fail to deliver those services and those supports in a way that offers people dignity, respect, agency, and autonomy. And so we really need to center families who are experiencing poverty, who've experienced poverty, as the designers of those programs, right? To help figure out what should the program look like? What should the policies look like? What are the goals that families have? And then the fifth and final piece is data. If narrative is overarching, data really undergirds all of the strategies and solutions that we need to put forward. And so why is that? So, similar to having billions of dollars deployed on programs, we have billions and billions of data points. We have tons of data that nonprofit organizations, government agencies are collecting. But rarely are those data matched across systems in a way that we can start to understand the interaction across programs, and that we can make the outcomes of those programs transparent, not just transparent to the program developers and the policymakers, but to families, right? So that those data can empower families to make choices about the programs that they decide to enroll in on their journey out of poverty. How do we know that the programs are effective? How does the program that's providing job training interact with the program that's providing childcare and early education, the program that's providing housing? And some of those programs might actually be serving some of the same families, or maybe they're not reaching all the families that they could be reaching because those data systems aren't connected.
That's fantastic. Kind of on that point about data, over the last 2 decades, I've read a number of academic research papers that are 2 or 3 inches thick, hundreds of pages with a lot of numbers, a lot of data that is useful, but it's very difficult for me to kind of work my way through. Your approach seems like an answer to that. And my guess is that the philanthropic community, the foundations of the world, will react to that kind of data as well. What's your take there?
Yeah, I think that that's right, and it's important for the investors in these programs, public and private, to have data, but it's equally important to place those data in the hands of families, and to your point, in a way that's usable. I mean, seriously, like it's wonderful that there are researchers that can produce 200-page reports, but is that usable data? And I think about where we are in 2021, right? most of us, probably most people listening to our conversation, have a smartphone in their pocket or in their purse. And think about the power of that data, the apps that we have that you can order your groceries, find a job, find an apartment, search for a new home. What if the data were matched in a way that were usable to families with low income that are seeking resources? So think about an app like Zillow or Redfin. Like, right, most of us are familiar with those apps. If you're looking to buy a home or rent an apartment, probably pull that phone out of your pocket, or you're curious, did the value of your home go up? What's going on in your neighborhood, right? I realize I'm talking to real estate developers, so you probably have commercial apps for this too. But what if an app like that had data for a family that's receiving a rental voucher to help, afford their housing costs? What if data were matched in a way where they could go into an app and they could look at it and say, well, I'd like to find an apartment or a home to rent for myself and my children that is in a neighborhood that has good schools, that is on good public transportation routes, is in a community that has access to good jobs, that has parks and playgrounds and libraries that are accessible. Those are all data that exist in different systems. But imagine being able, the time that it would save and the efficiency that would come with that and the good that would come from that. But right now, that doesn't exist in one place. Sure, you can go to one app and see where there's an apartment that maybe you can afford and you can use your voucher, but that's not going to tell you, well, is there high quality early childhood in that neighborhood? So there's a place for my child to go while I'm at work. Is there a way for me to get to work because I don't have a car right now? Is there a bus route that will take me directly from where I live to where the jobs are in my community?
You're preaching to the choir. Speaking of preaching, your first point was around changing the narrative. How can our faith community help in this, in that specific item as far as attacking, changing the narrative?
That's such a great question. And I think that the faith community has a really important role to play because I sort of referenced this before. Where do our ideas about poverty come from? Very often it is from our faith traditions, right? Why do we have poverty? Why does poverty exist? And I think that the faith community can have a huge influence in lifting up to members of your community or your congregation these structural forces that are keeping families trapped in poverty, and understanding that we all have a voice in our communities to advocate for different kinds of policies. So, who is making the decisions in your community about funding that's going to affordable housing, funding that's going to provide skills training, funding that's going to provide access to high quality early care and education in your community? And one of the things I think is most powerful about the faith community that virtually no other sector has, I'll just say, is the moral authority. The authority to be able to say, we need to do these things because they're the right thing to do for our community. We have beliefs that everyone deserves to thrive in our community. And in order to do that, we need different kinds of public policy. We need different priorities on how our public dollars are spent. Maybe we need different priorities on how some of our philanthropic and charitable dollars are spent too. But to be that voice and to influence others, I think is an incredibly important and powerful role.
That's great. That's fantastic. Any examples that you've come across, in the recent years that kind of are effective, that whether it's scale or not, because this is, it is a local issue. Every community is different. But is there anything that you've seen that you can talk a little bit about that maybe we can copy here in Indianapolis?
One of the things I've seen at the federal level, we're in an interesting time now because I feel like the context is shifting. So many of us have been through this pandemic, and many even middle-income families that never had to seek support, for food or for, because they're unemployed, have had to seek that support. And I think it's created a greater sense of empathy and understanding of some of the structural challenges. But every few years there will be at the federal level attempts to cut back on safety net programs. Food and nutrition programs, for example, school meals, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. And very often it is the faith community that has been most effective in going to members of Congress, right? And having that moral authority, which the business community doesn't. The business community has a different role, which I can or a different argument that they can make, I think, that can be powerful. But for the faith community to be able to say to members of Congress, so you call yourself a person of faith, And perhaps you share the same faith tradition. You call yourself a Christian, and for some people, this is what it means. It does mean that for those who have the least, that it is our duty to support one another. And I think that the faith community has a unique ability to make the argument, and I've seen it be effective at the federal level. So I think the same could be true locally, as a city council or as a mayor are making decisions about spending priorities, as a school board is making decisions about spending priorities. It's a really, really powerful voice. And I think very often, if you have a congregation, it's a voice that comes with lots of stakeholders and constituents they can put pressure on.
Sure. A lot of times, we work in silos. That's one of the big issues with kind of everything we're tackling around poverty. What are some examples of collaboration, unique collaboration that we can learn from, the kind of best practices? Because this doesn't happen unless we can touch all of the aspects of it. You have to touch these folks' lives at every aspect. And how can we work together and collaborate?
A great example, and there's so many I could lift up from across the country, but thinking about where I've seen effective partnerships across sectors, and that's often what it takes, right? I talked about the 5 big strategies around narrative, jobs, place, people, and data. It also takes cross-sector collaboration. It takes the faith community, the business community, nonprofits, philanthropy, government, education systems, health systems working together. And I think a really good example of that is actually out of Minneapolis. There's a program called the Jeremiah Program, which has been around for 20 plus years now. And I particularly like this example because it sort of combats that stereotype that innovation somehow happens on the coast. It happens all over the country. So about 20 plus years ago in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, as in many communities, community members were looking at who was most likely to be in poverty in our community. And not surprisingly, because it's true in many communities, they found that single mothers and their children were one of the populations most likely to be experiencing poverty. So they said, if we want to actually move the needle on poverty, we need to focus resources on these families. And so what could that look like? What would be effective? And it was actually a Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Connell, and partners who developed this program. And it was a partnership with the faith community, the business community, and you'll appreciate this, Rodney, actually some housing and real estate developers. And they said, if we're going to create a program that addresses the multiple structural challenges, we need to have different elements. So affordable housing is an issue. And so through donated land, they were able to develop a housing campus for single mothers and their children, bring in early childhood and community college partners, understanding that high quality early childhood education is one of the strategies that makes the biggest long-term difference in children who are born into poverty into their later life outcomes. And so they have a housing campus where they provide high quality birth to 5 early childhood services, safe, affordable, high quality housing for families, and then access to post-secondary education for the mothers that are in the program. They're all enrolled either in a community college or a 4-year college in career track education for high demand jobs in their community. But to make that happen, right, it took collaboration among all of these partners. And now under the leadership of their new executive director, Chastity Lord, they're even pushing further on the issue of narrative and really bending toward a social justice orientation that centers the mothers and uses their voices, really centering their voices and using their voices to lead around some of the narrative change and the advocacy work that needs to happen to shift policy. And what I love is this is a program that started in the Heartland and now has been replicated in several different communities around the country. So started in Minneapolis, replicated in St. Paul and Fargo, in Austin, Texas, and now in Brooklyn, in New York, and in Boston. So I love this idea of an innovation starting in the middle of the country and spreading to the coasts. I think we need more of that. And I think Indianapolis could be a great place to seed some of these kinds of ideas as well.
We agree. And we thank you for helping us think about it. You're talking about those systems and structures that need to be in place to remove the barriers. Can you talk about how maybe at a higher policy level that we should be thinking about this?
Yeah, one of the things, particularly right now in this time, we have some groundbreaking legislation that has been passed. And what the researchers and the predictive models say, so when I'm talking specifically about the expanded child tax credit, which is, the way it's structured. And it's for 1 year that will provide advance payments. The Treasury Department has to figure out how to do it, of up to $3,600 a year or $300 a month for families with children under 6, and slightly smaller amount for children 6 to 17. That, coupled with expanded SNAP food and nutrition supports, the economic impact payments that the majority of Americans are receiving. What the Urban Institute has done an analysis of that, and they predict that it's going to cut child poverty in half.
Wow.
But for that to be effective, there has to be mobilization at the community level. Because it's one thing to pass the policy at the federal level, but how are families in Indianapolis going to access those benefits? There are families who perhaps before haven't filed their income tax returns. So they're not connected to the systems in order to access these resources. And so there's important work to be done on the community level to ensure that those resources are accessed by the families who are eligible. But then there's a second piece, that's phase 1. Phase 2 is saying, okay, we've done this for a year. And if it's actually going to cut child poverty in half, do we just need to do it for a year, or do we need to make that permanent? And so there's advocacy work to be done. And this is where I think the business community can play an important role. Those dollars, right, you can call them economic impact payments, child tax credits, but what those dollars result in is resources, financial resources flowing into communities across the country that wouldn't be there before. And guess where do those resources get spent? They get spent at local businesses, right? I mean, there are grocery stores around this country, if not for SNAP payments, they wouldn't be viable businesses, because that's a huge amount of revenue. And guess what? That revenue is creating the job for the cashier at the grocery store, the butcher at the grocery store, the people making the baked goods at the grocery store. And so there's also a business case to be made. And I think it's going to be really important that there are constituents across every congressional district, because this affects every congressional district. I don't care if it's red, blue, or purple. This affects your local economy. And so I think there's really important work to get people to understand that and to help make some of these federal changes permanent, but then make sure they're implemented well at the local level.
Another kind of thought that, smart people smarter than me around town are kind of thinking about is just as folks from mass incarceration and policy changes when they come back into the system. How do you see that impacting this kind of move in poverty?
Yeah, this is where we have to recognize how interconnected different issues are. So you may have a family member who's been involved in the justice system and is now coming home. Well, there are lots of federal and local policies that create barriers to people being able to reintegrate, being able to get a job, being able to get safe, stable, affordable housing. And so in some ways, you got to go kind of one by one and look at what are your local policies. If we say that we want people to be integrated into society, be productive members of society, then why are we creating all these barriers that stop them from doing that, right? All of us as people, as human beings, we have to have a safe place to live. We have to be able to have jobs available to us. If you're going to say, well, you have something in your past that's going to just stay with you for the rest of your life and now you can never get a job, well, how are you supposed to contribute to society? How are you, that's not going to work. And by the way, a large percentage of, both men and women coming back into communities have children. And so that's going to impact the next generation. First of all, mom or dad have been locked up and missing from their lives. And now they're back, but they aren't able to get that job. They aren't able to get that housing to be able to support those children in the next generation. And so we have to understand how all of these issues are connected. I think often there is this tendency to vilify adults, right? And somehow say, let's focus on the children. But I think, again, if we stop and think, I always think children don't grow up in a Cabbage Patch. They grow up in a family, in a household, and that family can look all different kinds of ways. But we have to create the structures that allow parents, families, adults in children's lives to be able to nurture them, to have access to the resources it takes to be able to do that.
That's fantastic. Thanks. Another barrier that we've kind of encountered is just access to healthcare. And I think it's really a light should be shown on it during this pandemic over the last year now, how disproportionately folks in poverty are being impacted by this. Have you guys seen any data yet on that matter? And what's your take in general of how COVID-19 is impacting, poverty here in the United States and in Indianapolis?
I think that the thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has, the pandemic itself, the health impact, but then also the economic impact, in some ways, it has pulled back a curtain for the country. I think there are many of us that have been in this work who are not surprised by the disproportionate impact on communities with low income, on communities of color. But if you didn't know it before, you certainly, if you watch the news, read the paper, it's very clear the disproportionate impact in terms of who is susceptible, who is more likely to get infected with COVID-19. And a lot of that has to do with, well, who is living in unstable, overcrowded housing? Who are our essential workers? Who is working in frontline jobs? Who are our grocery store workers? Who are our care workers, right? And that is disproportionately people of color, disproportionately women of color. And that is where we're seeing both the health impact and the economic impact. And so I think the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis has just exacerbated a situation that already existed and perhaps spread to people who were even maybe more moderate or slightly higher income and are starting to see that impact. I think if there's a lesson here is that, like, we really do need to care about all of us. Again, we're all connected, right? What affects one of us affects all of us. So we need the kinds of policies that provide access to healthcare for everyone, right? The thing about the pandemic is it's spread through the air. So it doesn't matter who you are. There is some likelihood that you could be impacted. And I think now, as I said before, some people are going to be more vulnerable, but the lesson should be understanding how interconnected we all are and needing to have the kinds of structurals and solutions and policies that make high quality healthcare affordable and accessible to everyone. I'd say maybe a bright spot, if there are any in the pandemic, is how quickly so many systems pivoted in ways that perhaps they wouldn't had there not been a crisis. So things like telehealth and telemedicine, for folks that had access to the technology, made those services more accessible in a way that they haven't been before. And so I think there's some important lessons that perhaps we can take into recovery and post-pandemic to say, particularly around mental health, right? People being able to access services, access mental health therapists from their home. And I think that particularly becomes important for families who may have children, and you might ordinarily have to miss an appointment because you have a sick child, or your car breaks down, or your ride or your transportation falls through. Being able to have access to some of those services online actually makes them more accessible to families that would otherwise have challenges. And so maybe post-pandemic, we'll see more of that carry through as an option.
Sure. At CTS, mental health aspect is an important part of how we serve and how we operate. We understand completely the importance there. You have a captivated audience here. We're ready to jump. What's one thing that you would piece of advice or direction you give the folks from the faith community, the business community, and the public sector that can start to move this needle, because it doesn't happen very quickly?
Yeah, I would say each of those sectors, one of the things they have in common is they very often set or create tables. So one thing is think about, the tables that you already have set, creating some space for people to pull up more chairs. I often like to, quote Troy Chisholm, who said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. What I now say, I've sort of created an addendum to that is I'm at a place in my life and my career where I do have a seat at the table. I've been very privileged to sit at tables at the Gates Foundation, at the White House, at the Aspen Institute, but I still bring a folding chair. And I should sit on that folding chair and give up my seat to someone who hasn't had a seat at the table. And very often that person is a person who has experienced poverty, whose voice hasn't been heard. So partly it's creating space at tables, but at one another's tables. So you may have a business table that you sit around, a Chamber of Commerce table. Think about broadening that at times and bringing in people from the faith community, from the nonprofit sector, from the philanthropic sector, right? And then creating some new tables that are perhaps cross-sector tables, because it's going to take all of us to solve these problems. I would say, and for people that are working in a particular sector, maybe you work on housing or maybe you work on job training, and that's good. Keep your focus, but also open up your aperture and think about how your work might connect to colleagues who are working on early childhood, who are working on housing, and think about how you might come together around solving some of these problems. Because if we keep operating in silos, I always say it's kind of like, it's good to have focus, but it's sort of like a horse with blinders on. Then you only see what's in front of you. And very often that innovation is happening at the margins. It's happening at the intersection of different issues and sectors. So creating some of those spaces where people can come together.
Again, like all of your responses, this is great. This is exciting. And you tell it with such ease. It has me excited. It's giving me the shot in the arm, that you need, because this is difficult work and it takes forever, but you can see change. Is there a moment, in the last 5, 10, or even throughout your career where you can just specifically point to that shot in the arm that really kind of got you to the next step and really impacted your life and others?
I would say in the last 5 years, I've been at this now 25 years, but in the last 5 years, even pre-pandemic, there has been a surge of interest around the issue of poverty and economic mobility. And I think what I partly attribute that to is actually the new big data that we have available. I guess, I don't know, I feel like it's unfortunate that it takes this, because people at the community level, people on the front lines have often known this and seen this. But now we have big, large data sets that show us that zip code really does make a difference, and show us that mobility in the United States has stagnated. We have data that shows us, and this is just in the last 5 years or so, that in 1940, for a child, children born in 1940, they had a 90% chance of making more money than their parents. When we fast forward and we look at 1980, so those are people who today would be in their early 40s, we have large data sets that say that only 50% of them are likely to earn more money than their parents. So dropping from 90%, almost everyone, to 50% is a huge drop. And 50%, economists will tell you, is basically, that's a coin toss. That's what you would expect. So that is stagnant mobility. And I think what was so powerful about that is it affects everyone. We're not just talking about a small group of people. We are talking about the whole country. Every child born in the United States. That this idea that we have this American dream, right? If the dream is that you can work hard and get ahead, or that even if you struggle, your children have a chance to do better, that's just not been true anymore. It's not been true for a long while. And that, I think, has elevated people's consciousness about this issue, this idea that if you hear people in your community saying, gosh, it just seems like it's so much harder to get ahead than it used to be, it's because it is. And I think that large consciousness, and then sort of what the country has been through in the last year on top of it with the pandemic, with people whose eyes were not open before around issues of racial inequality and structural racism, is, I feel like we're still in it. We're in the midst of this contextual shift, and hopefully a reckoning and a change in the country we aspire to be, and then the country that we actually are. How do we get those things to come closer together? And I think we're in a tough moment, but it's a good moment in that I guess maybe the way I'd put it is, it can feel like we're breaking apart, and that's hard, but sometimes you have to break apart before you can come back together and heal. So I feel like we're in that breaking apart, but my hope is that what's ahead is that healing. And with that healing will come, I don't know, the creation of a new kind of country where we do actually live up to the ideals that we purport to have, that it is the kind of country where everyone has a chance to get ahead and to do a little bit better.
Sure. Well, in Indianapolis, our eyes are open and we're ready to set the table. And we'll have folding chairs for you and anyone else whenever you want to come help us out. Nisha, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure spending time with you today and over the last few weeks. And your work it's wonderful. And we really hope that we talked about in the beginning of this discussion that Indianapolis raises the bar for how we address moving people out of poverty. And we have all the resources and all the talent to do it. So let's do it. And this, hopefully this conversation will really spark a few more ideas, and you'll be hearing from us in the near future. Thank you so much, Nisha.
Thank you, Rodney. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to being in Indianapolis in person, maybe sometime next year.